Standing with a moving truck in the background, my mother-in-law said triumphantly, "I won't be giving out our address to strangers." Behind her, my husband was getting into the car, smirking foolishly. It seemed he was seriously considering following his parents. I quietly bit my lip. This is always how they are. Assuming I won't retort, they do as they please. My father-in-law is a decent person but has outdated beliefs, thinking a woman should obey her husband and be supported by him. He is of no use. But I've reached my breaking point. I've endured and accumulated my patience like water in a cup. And now, it's the last drop. Then, it's divorce from a freeloader husband. At my words, my in-laws laughed in unison. Such nonsense, you silly wife. They still don't know yet. My husband relies on me financially, and even the little income he earns, he owes it to me. I bet they don't grasp that I have my limits too. My name is Gina Manning, and I'm exactly 50 years old. I work at a local supermarket run by my brother. It was originally our parents' company, but my brother took over when our father fell ill after turning 60. What started as a family business is now a cherished local store. Though it's a store, it operates as a company, and I hold a position there. When my parents worked, my father was the president, and my mother was the executive vice president. However, since my brother's wife was a school teacher and couldn't be employed, I became the executive vice president from my brother's generation. Now, the only family I live with is my husband, Fred. We have a daughter who's married and visits us a few times a year. However, my daughter and her husband live in a distant state, so we can't meet often. My husband and I were high school classmates. Back then, we were just classmates. Back in those days, I was shy and hardly had any male friends, let alone a boyfriend. Compared to me, who always hung out with female friends. Popular Fred was always surrounded by a lively group of male and female friends. We reunited as adults, hit it off, and got married. I like someone modest and gentle like you, Gina. Blushing, he vowed a future with me. It was later that I realized this choice was a mistake, when everything was too late. The relentless taunts from my mother-in-law started immediately after our marriage. Quit your job and devote yourself to Fred. And do have children as soon as possible, or you're useless as a wife. Those were the first words she said to me. At the time, I was nothing more than an employee at the supermarket. My husband was working normally then, so I could somewhat understand why my old-fashioned mother-in-law didn't get my job. But saying I'm useless if I don't have any children seemed too much. Even after having a child, my mother-in-law didn't change. My baby was a girl. Then, my mother-in-law arrogantly said, "A girl? Disappointing. You need to have a boy soon." I had 2 boys myself. To me, my precious daughter was irreplaceable, but to my mother-in-law, she was just a girl. My husband loved our daughter but never argued with his mother at their house. Instead, he joined her in mocking me. She can't seem to have another child. And her cooking is terrible, too, nothing like mom's. Then, my mother-in-law, pleased, clapped her hands and laughed. Happy, she gave my husband some pocket money, and he joyfully spent it on alcohol and dubious magazines. You could at least take my side for once. And it's pitiful for our daughter, isn't it? After getting home and expressing my displeasure, Fred Manning sighed in annoyance. She's just a baby, she won't understand, and you're worrying too much. Just play along with mom, and she'll be happy. Just bear with it. It was indeed tough, but it's true that our interactions were only during visits to my in-laws. Maybe I should accept that if I just endure, things will settle down. The frustration never faded, but I kept enduring silently. However, the situation took a turn for the worse. My mother-in-law, who previously had no chance to see us unless we visited her, started coming to our house. It all started with my husband's unemployment. His company went under due to poor performance. Naturally, with my husband unemployed, there was no income other than his unemployment benefits, which were temporary and wouldn't last long. Obviously, we couldn't live like that. So, I accepted a full-time position with responsibilities that my brother had offered, and I began to work seriously. Our household depended on my income. With the grand cause of helping my son, my mother-in-law, armed with this righteous excuse, started visiting our home frequently. My father-in-law seemed dismayed by her overprotectiveness, but she paid no heed to his looks. My mother-in-law's actions were quite extreme. It seemed like she found fault in everything I did. When she started refolding the laundry I had folded and taking it out of the dresser, I went from being astounded to frightened. I couldn't understand what drove her to act this way. If she dislikes it so much, I thought she shouldn't bother coming to a house where I live. Gina, when are you going to quit your job? It's because of you that Fred can't find a job. She started making absurd demands of me, the sole breadwinner of the family. I looked to my husband for a rebuttal, but he awkwardly looked away. It wasn't my fault that my husband couldn't find a job. My husband had no qualifications and only office work experience with no special skills. He could have found work if he wasn't so picky, saying, "I don't want anything but office work. Physical labor is out of the question, and I can't work late nights." In essence, it was my husband's own fault he couldn't find work. However, in my mother-in-law's view, my working was the cause of my husband's lack of motivation and the root of all evils. She continued her usual behavior towards our daughter. "Granny's here." Despite saying such things, she publicly stated that daughters were less valuable than sons. When our daughter, old enough to understand, started avoiding her grandmother who only made derogatory remarks, she spat. "You're just like your mother. Not cute at all." My daughter was shocked, but my husband did nothing but lay in front of the TV. That's no way to talk. If you dislike me and my daughter so much, you don't have to come here. Unable to contain my frustration, I spoke out, and my mother-in-law arrogantly responded, "This is my son's house, so it's none of your business. If you have a complaint, you should leave." Again, to clarify, my husband was unemployed. I was the one supporting the family. I was furious with my mother-in-law's refusal to face reality. Every time I saw my husband's back as he lay around, ignoring everything, I felt sad. After reporting the matter to my father-in-law, who adores his granddaughter, he seemed to have scolded his wife. She stopped making remarks about our daughter and reduced her visits to our home by about half. Years later, my husband decided to embrace a life without work and became a complete freeloader. Meanwhile, I contributed more to the supermarket's revenue by coming up with new ideas from a housewife's perspective, investing more effort into my work. When the supermarket was hiring part-time workers, I suggested it to my husband. "It's an easy job. Why don't you give it a try?" Eventually, he managed to get employed, working only twice a week. When we visited my in-laws during Thanksgiving, my husband proudly reported his employment. Despite it not being entirely his effort, I felt it was better than nothing and watched over him warmly. "You finally found a job, Fred. You're truly commendable. Work hard and shut your wife up. Make her quit her job soon. A wife's place is in protecting the home, after all." In a voice loud enough for everyone to hear, my mother-in-law spoke to my husband. Moreover, whenever we went to visit the grave, she would start bad-mouthing me to acquaintances and neighbors we encountered. It's shameful to have a wife who's just earning pocket money at her parents' company and neglecting her household duties. My poor son is the one suffering because of it. I was relentlessly ridiculed by my mother-in-law in front of others. "This is disgraceful. Stop it." The only one who spoke up, unable to stand it any longer, was my father-in-law. My feelings of sadness only grew towards my husband, who pretended not to notice. I continued to endure everything. If it weren't for my mother-in-law's visits, my husband, despite being lazy, would be a kind father. I thought it best for our daughter to have her father around until she became independent, so I kept enduring. Even after it became unnecessary to endure any longer, I lacked the energy to initiate a divorce. The fact that my mother-in-law's visits had almost ceased over the years was a significant factor. The turning point came this year. My in-laws decided to move from the house they had lived in for many years to an apartment. We plan to make it our final home. The view from the balcony is nice. My father-in-law, more energetic than usual, seemed excited. I sympathized with their desire to leave the overly large house for a life that was more manageable. The preparations for the move were indeed challenging. The house was cluttered with belongings, requiring significant downsizing to fit into the smaller apartment. Clothes that were either too big or out of fashion and no longer wearable, along with a huge number of paper bags. There were even unopened gifts from years past, such as year-end and mid-year presents. While it was possible to sell received items like towels, expired food had to be thrown away. There was also a need to reduce the excessive number of dishes for just the two of them. "Mother, keeping everything is impossible. I understand how you feel, but the new house is smaller than this one, right?" Most of the items that needed to be discarded belonged to my mother-in-law. Naturally, she was very resistant to me touching them. "Don't talk nonsense. Do you want my things that badly? How shallow." Holding onto the trash that I can possibly want, my mother-in-law glared at me. I decided it was a loss to even speak up and shrugged, walking away. Finally, the day came for my in-laws to move. I had not yet been told the precise location of their new apartment. Unfortunately, I wasn't particularly eager to know, planning to wait until they chose to tell me. The moving truck was the smallest size, a light truck. Watching, I worried whether all the belongings would fit, and sure enough, they began to overflow. Then, my husband started loading our car with the excess. Moreover, my in-laws got into the car. There was no space left for me. As I stood there dumbfounded, my husband started the engine with a composed face. In a panic, I knocked on the car window. "What are you doing? Are you taking your parents to their place? Should I just wait here?" Then, my husband cracked open the window and said, just find your own way back. I'm going to live with my parents. Take some time off work or something. See ya." Standing there in shock, the backseat door opened next to me. My mother-in-law got out. She declared triumphantly, "Fred said he's tired of being scolded by his wife every day, so we decided to take him with us. You should reflect on your loneliness." After finishing her declaration, my mother-in-law deliberately nudged my shoulder. Reluctantly, I asked, "Could you give me the new address, just in case something happens? I won't give out our address to strangers." This time, I was truly speechless. I had reached my limit of endurance, feeling the accumulated droplets of patience spill over. Today was the day of the last drop, I thought. Then, it's divorce from a freeloader husband. I stated it plainly, yet with a slight emphasis on freeloader. My mother-in-law clearly heard it, glancing at my husband before quickly regaining her composure and glaring at me with contempt. My father-in-law, who had been inside the car and might not have heard well, made a questioning look and deliberately got out. I decided to make it clear to him too. "I will proceed with the divorce from Fred, who is currently in a freeloader state. Please take care of him from now on. I will not be bothered any longer. Thank you for everything up to this point." As I said politely, the sound of the engine mixed with my in-laws' laughter. "Such nonsense, you silly wife. It seems neither of them understands the gravity of the situation." Leaning on the open window, my husband also looked up at me with a faint smile. "It's impossible for Fred, who's working, to be a freeloader. You wouldn't be able to live without him." I felt pity for my father-in-law's frown. Thinking to myself that it's your son who won't be able to live without me, I tilted my head. "You do know about my income, right?" Then, my father-in-law shook his head. In front of my surprised self, my mother-in-law yelled in an irritated tone, "As if you're any better, living off your parents' pocket money." At this point, I finally realized. My in-laws truly knew nothing about our financial situation. At least, I had told my mother-in-law when I first took on my current job. Whether she had forgotten because it was a long time ago or she never intended to understand in the first place, I couldn't have imagined they were this uninformed. But now, it seemed irrelevant. Understood. I will send the divorce papers later. I felt strangely clear-headed as I said this. Explaining myself became too troublesome. Once I had made up my mind, strangely, my heart wouldn't be swayed anymore. Then, my husband chimed in. "How are you going to send it without knowing the address, huh? You're surprisingly clueless." Laughing, he ushered my in-laws into the car. Then, with a short honk of the horn, they drove away. I just silently watched them leave. After taking a taxi home, I immediately went to the municipal office to get a divorce form and started filling it out. Not knowing the current address wasn't an issue. I could use Paul Manning's name and their former address for mailing to Mr. Paul Manning, Fred Manning. As long as they had filed a change of address, the mail should reach their new residence. Since my mother-in-law orders various supplements through mail order, it should be fine. I chose to send the divorce papers with a proof of delivery. On my way back, thinking about the possibility of the papers being torn up, I prepared several copies of the divorce form. A few days later, while filling out my name on one of the spare forms, the house phone rang. I thought it might be my husband, but it was different. The caller was my father-in-law. "Hello? The divorce papers arrived, but are you serious? This is too much for just a spiteful act." I couldn't help but chuckle, thinking he still sighed as mere spite. Until now, I thought my father-in-law was sensible, but perhaps he's just part of that family after all. "Of course, I'm serious. You can submit it there, or I've included a return envelope, so you can send it back to me if you prefer. Don't worry about my livelihood. I'm an executive at a company, so I do have an income." I responded firmly. Then my father-in-law murmured, somewhat perplexed, A woman being an executive. Is that even possible? He still seemed doubtful. I remember telling him before that I was the executive vice president of a small company, but how had he taken that? Perhaps he hadn't been listening at all. Or maybe, considering my father-in-law is quite hard of hearing, he misunderstood. There are female executives in other companies too. But it's fine if you don't believe me. I've reached my limit of endurance. I've had enough. I answered dispassionately, too tired to explain further. Then, my father-in-law grunted lowly. I see. I won't say anything then. Sorry for all the trouble. His tone sounded genuinely apologetic, which made me feel somewhat relieved. It seems my father-in-law was, after all, slightly on the reasonable side. I politely responded with a simple no problem and hung up. Half a day after my father-in-law's call, the next contact came from my husband. My smartphone rang while I was out, showing my husband's name. It seemed like a good opportunity to turn on the recording function and start the conversation. Hey, this is terrible, suddenly talking about divorce. Sending this kind of thing, I'll sue you. You better change your mind, or it won't end well for you. Despite having voluntarily separated himself, his remarks were ludicrously optimistic. Given their declaration that I'm a stranger and their refusal to share their address before leaving, it's only natural for me to consider divorce. It's truly infuriating how my husband pretends to be the victim. The main reason is the repeated emotional abuse, isn't it? It's sad that the diaries I've kept since my youth will serve as evidence. Your leaving on your own accord also works against you in this case, it seems. My lawyer mentioned that you would be at fault. Throughout my explanation, my husband interspersed with dismissive interjections like, "Ha! And what?" His attitude made me doubt if he was listening, but mentioning a lawyer suddenly made him panic. A lawyer? You can't be serious. His voice echoed with agitation. I had the phone on speaker mode, allowing the person in front of me to hear as well. I nodded smilingly at the person in front of me, my lawyer, and replied firmly. Of course, I'm serious. I'm actually consulting right now. From now on, let's cease direct discussions and proceed through lawyers. Before I could finish saying to contact through the lawyer, my husband shouted, interrupting me. No way, I will never agree to a divorce. What about my job? It will make things awkward. Let's meet and talk. I'll come to your house right now. Please listen to me. I could faintly hear my mother-in-law encouraging a breakup in the background, prompting her eye smile. The lawyer in front of me, whom I was consulting with, appeared as if he wanted to say, "Oh dear." Considering what to do next, the lawyer quickly wrote a note and showed it to me, suggesting we invite him to the office. Following her advice, I instructed my husband. I'm not at home. I'm at my lawyer's office. If you insist on meeting, come here. After giving him the office's location, he promised to come and hung up. I sipped the coffee provided by the office staff, waiting for my husband to arrive. I wonder if he'll really come. He's so cowardly and he might just run away scared. While we were talking, my husband soon arrived. I thought I would be facing my husband with the lawyer present, but he wasn't alone. His parents were with him. It was clear he had said, "I can't do it alone, come with me," or something to that effect, bringing along his mommy and daddy. I was dismayed by his lack of independence. Upon entering the office, my husband appeared nervous, looking around restlessly. My lawyer sat beside me, ready to face the three of them. The confrontation was about to begin. Look, no, I can't even think about divorce. Facing me across the table, my husband immediately started speaking in a quick, quiet voice. Despite his loudness on the phone, he could barely speak in front of others. I firmly rejected his pleas. No, I absolutely want a divorce. I never want to live together again. Since we're here with legal experts, let's also discuss the division of property. My husband flinched at this. He glanced at the lawyer and then fell silent. He could confront me or the female employees all he wanted, but in front of a male lawyer, he was utterly passive. I sighed involuntarily. My husband remained silent, my father-in-law just closed his eyes and crossed his arms, and my mother-in-law, unable to hide her intense emotions, glared at me. What assets? We won't divide a single penny with you. She then attempted to throw her freshly served hot coffee at me. The office staff quickly restrained her, narrowly avoiding danger. Ideally, the assets accumulated during our marriage should be split evenly between Fred and me, as income earned during the marriage is considered a joint effort under the law. However, if both parties agree, the situation can be different. Fine, let's say no division of property then. I responded coolly. Notably, most of the income was earned by me, and naturally, the bank accounts holding the assets were also in my name. In fact, even the car my husband proudly used was registered in my name. His bank book, left at our house, showed barely less than $15, partly because of the days before payday. In essence, my husband had almost no assets. Declaring no division of property essentially meant I would keep everything. Despite the dire implications, my husband remained silent, only fidgeting awkwardly. "You're okay with this?" I asked in a tone akin to admonishing a child. Then, after being silent throughout the conversation, my father-in-law opened his eyes and whispered to Fred in a grave tone, "Tell the truth." Still, Fred hesitated. Mumbling something inaudible, he shockingly collapsed into his mother's lap. While his mother gently stroked his head, she continued to glare at me. It was a moment that truly epitomized the feeling of revulsion. Really disgusting. In the end, Fred and I agreed to a divorce without any division of property. I promptly took out a spare divorce form I had fortunately brought along, and Fred's expression turned pitifully despondent. As they were leaving, my father-in-law caught my eye and bowed significantly. Watching his retreating back, I pondered that although he hadn't been on my side, he wasn't exactly an enemy either. Despite sensing his belief in the old-fashioned value that men are superior to women, he was a man who could admit his mistakes. After my in-laws and Fred had left, I finally allowed myself a small smile. The lawyer sitting beside me had been unusually quiet, seemingly biting the inside of his cheek to suppress his laughter. Considering the party that should have been fighting over the division of assets had just voluntarily relinquished any claim, his reaction was understandable. After the meeting, I hurriedly filed the divorce papers. Freedom at last. However, the ordeal wasn't over. The following week, now my ex-husband, Fred, boldly appeared at my workplace. If he had simply come to work normally, it would have been fine, but that was not the case. Ignoring his duties entirely, he began following me around incessantly. "Gina, I was wrong. You hadn't submitted the divorce papers yet, right? I'll come back home, so let's make up." Having work of my own and being in different departments, his following me was nothing but a nuisance. No matter how many times I told him to return to his post, he wouldn't listen. Instead, he stepped in front of me in the store and lay sprawled on the floor. "Wha? Please." His cries for attention, while flailing his legs, drew the eyes of customers, leaving me dizzy with embarrassment. This was utterly intolerable. I decided then to fire him. The decision was unanimously supported by all employees, including my brother. In fact, there had been multiple complaints about Fred's work attitude from other staff members. It was only due to my insistence that we had kept him employed this long. Naturally, no one was sorry to see him go. The next day, the supermarket was again thrown into chaos. "My son has been unfairly dismissed. You must have influenced the company somehow," raged my mother-in-law, livid with anger. I directed her to the break room in the back. Following my brother's suggestion, we called Fred and also invited my father-in-law. With my brother and a few employees as witnesses, the final meeting began. First, I explained the disgraceful behavior Fred exhibited the day before. Then, I addressed the accusation my mother-in-law had made. "You must have influenced the company somehow." I decided on the termination myself. Such behavior is nothing but a disruption to business. It's impossible to keep him employed under these circumstances. Hearing my response, my father-in-law seemed almost impressed as he commented, "You have that kind of authority." Everyone from our side in the room nodded in agreement. Even Fred, who was noticeably shrinking in his chair, understood this much. My mother-in-law was the only one taken aback. I laid out the facts calmly. "Of course, I do. I'm the deputy manager and executive vice president. In our small company, most decisions are made directly by the president and me." Executive. Finally. grasping my position, she turned pale almost instantaneously, trying to get Fred to look up by shaking his arm. Ignoring them, my father-in-law continued his inquiry. "So, you were the high earner?" I slowly nodded in confirmation. "Yes, Fred is just a part-time employee working twice a week. There's no way he can match the executive compensation I receive. It's not even 1/10, closer to 100. And you mentioned my job was due to parental connections, but Fred's employment was 100% through my connections. I admit I was wrong about that. This outcome is actually the correct one." This time, my mother-in-law was left speechless. Surely, by now, it's obvious who has been supporting the household. It's surprising she didn't know, but it's irrelevant now. This is just revenge, mixing personal issues with business. My ex-husband protested. It's high time he looked for employment elsewhere. His audacity to still want to work here under these circumstances is too much. The main issue is your poor conduct. There have been complaints from other employees about you, like how you're always napping in the break room during work hours, or the inappropriate comments to female staff. You should remember being scolded for these things, right? Oh, was it too hard being scolded by me, so you ran away with your parents? I couldn't help but lower my voice. My ex-husband started to cry, making a deep sound in his throat. My child would never do such things. I presented evidence in front of the outraged mother-in-law, surveillance footage and recordings made by other employees, documenting a history of misconduct. I regret having defended such a person in the past. My mother-in-law was dumbfounded. When she reached out to him, presumably to comfort him, she surprisingly pinched his ear with incredible force instead. "What have you done?" My ex-husband screamed, protecting his head from her. Her fury was unstoppable. She started hitting him with a cushion she had been sitting on. With no other option, I addressed the only person still seated calmly, my father-in-law. All this time, when he didn't work, I quietly helped out by working extra hours alongside the part-timers. I apologized to those he inconvenienced, offering apologies and gifts. It was all my fault. I'm sorry for the trouble caused to other employees, and I'm glad he's finally been fired. My mother-in-law sobbed in frustration. My father-in-law solemnly apologized to all of us employees. "Let's go home. Gina, I'll have a word with Fred. We promise not to bother you again. Thank you for everything." Saying this, he stood up. Given his old-fashioned nature, he'll likely keep his word. I felt genuinely inclined to believe him. Hearing this, my ex-husband looked as if it was the end of the world for him. My mother-in-law, almost in a whisper due to her clenched teeth, vented her frustration. "Why would you say such a thing? That's a huge loss. We need to get them back together for Fred's sake." Finally understanding the reality of her son's character, she seemed desperate not to let me go. Indeed, without me, my ex-husband's life would be nearly over. That's exactly what I wish for, so I have no intention of helping at all. As I was about to respond, a thunderous voice echoed through the building. "Enough." Furious, he stood tall and imposing, resembling a guardian deity. Even my mother-in-law couldn't retort, just gaping down in silence. My ex-husband cowered under his father's wrath. "She may have been your daughter-in-law, but she's someone we received from another family. In the end, she's a stranger. Don't even think about mooching off her. Aren't you ashamed?" And today, it was clear Fred caused a lot of trouble. "Fred, apologize on your knees." I was taken aback by such intensity from my father-in-law, who was usually quiet and reserved. Perhaps I never fully understood my in-laws. In the end, my ex-husband, shielded by his mother, did not kneel and fled as if running away. Only my father-in-law turned back to apologize deeply one last time. Thank you, Father. Take care of yourself, I said and watched him leave, deciding to forgive at least him. Let's get back to work, shall we? With that, the supermarket returned to its routine. The following part of the story took place at a later date. Afterward, my in-laws ended up living strictly on their pensions, still burdened with their unemployed son in his 50s. When I happened to see my mother-in-law in town, she looked disheartened and significantly diminished. Rumor has it that Fred has become something of a recluse, completely useless. Since then, I haven't encountered Fred even once. The following part was relayed to me by my daughter. About 3 years after the divorce, my father-in-law's funeral took place. She attended as his granddaughter. Apparently, my father-in-law's passing was sudden, leaving no time for preparations. The funeral was quite modest due to financial constraints. With my father-in-law gone, my mother-in-law and Fred's two-person household was far from thriving. Their home quickly became cluttered and dirty without my father-in-law's cleanliness, turning it into a garbage house. They've become somewhat notorious in the neighborhood. Additionally, the decrease in pension following my father-in-law's death has led them to solicit money from various sources, further tarnishing their reputation. Their situation seems dire, but their troubles are a source of inconvenience to others. Reflecting on my mother-in-law and Fred's impending solitude and financial difficulties, I felt no inclination to help. Instead, I felt a sense of relief from the frustrations of the past. Years have passed, and I'm now enjoying living alone in a lovely apartment. I hadn't realized how wonderful it would be to have free time to myself. Hosting dinner parties for friends of my age has become my greatest joy. My daughter and her husband also look out for me. Come to think of it, she's always disliked her grandmother and intends to cut off all contact moving forward. That's a good idea. Especially now, it's important to avoid stress during this crucial time. There's no need to expose your baby to that environment. My daughter, gently touching her growing belly, nodded in agreement. I'm about to become a grandmother. Of course, I'm willing to do anything to support my daughter and her family, but I'm also careful not to intrude on the young couple's life. As I approach my 60s, I find that among my friends, some have chosen to remain single or have been widowed. Lately, we've been discussing the possibility of living together as a group of single ladies in the future. Rather than enduring silently, I dream of a life where I can discuss anything with friends. Surrounded by happiness, I'm sure to continue enjoying the best days ahead.